there are plenty of relics from the 1980s that just wouldn't fly in 2020. Leg warmers, trickle-down economics, trapper keepers, Charlie Sheen as a legitimate actor.
Are you new in town?
Yeah.
Clearly these things need to be left in the 80s. And there's no difference in football. The NFL had a unique look in the decade. Headbands, sweaty Dan Marino, spotting John Candy in the crowd. But there were things on the field that make us wonder what the hell has happened in the last 3 decades since we bid farewell to the 10 years that gave us high art like Alf and Lethal Weapon. Stuff from the 80s that wouldn't fly in today's NFL is coming up right after this. Did you know this used to be a gaming channel?
What's going on? It's Mr. 5 Points here.
Yeah, that's me, cringing it up back in the day. But did you also know that I still love gaming? That's why I want to tell you about Raid Shadow Legends, which, like the Rangers' playoff hopes this year, is a deep dive into dark fantasy and realism. Check this game out. It has all the elements of being both a GM and a player. You build up your characters and upgrade them, then take them out onto the field for PvP battles to continue to win and build up your squad. See how I use the silver to upgrade my bro right here? They've got everything, campaigns, and my favorite, dungeons, where you can fight bosses and win new artifacts that will help your champions become stronger. Even better, the Season 1 Battle Pass is live, so you can get awesome rewards and upgrades, new champions, and daily and weekly challenges. So what exactly are you waiting for? Oh, you think this costs money and is only on one platform? Nope, it's on PC, Android, and iOS, and guess what? It's free to install. So go to one of the links below and get 50k of that silver I told you about and get a free Epic Champion as part of the new Epic Player program to start your journey. Raid Shadow Legends. Download it today. Lack of TV graphics. If you turn on a replay of a game from the 1980s, you'll be instantly lost, and that's because there was no permanent indication of the score, game clock, play clock, down and distance, or even the quarter. At best, TV networks would flash the graphics in between plays coming back from commercial, but if you were just tuning in, you would have to wait to even find out what stage the game was in. Today we've got timeouts, stats, analytics, super analytics, PFF ratings, something called a green zone, pretty much everything you could want on the screen, and plenty more that absolutely isn't necessary, like golf leaderboards. Back then it was a clean picture of football, no clutter at all. Marie Kondo would have loved it. And who knows, maybe she was a huge football fan back in the 80s. I doubt it. No red zone / Sunday ticket. If you didn't live in your favorite team's local market, you were going to have a tough time seeing them play. Scott Hansen was but a lad in the 1980s, so there was no red zone, and Sunday ticket was just a gleam in the eye of John Taffer. Yep, the bar rescue guy who introduced Sunday ticket to bars in 1994. Either you got lucky and the game was showing in your vicinity, or you had to catch the highlights, which the post games may or may not have even shown. Then again, it did make it all that more convincing to go see a game in person, and in that era, tickets were cheaper, parking didn't cost an arm and a leg, and you didn't have to refinance your mortgage in order to buy a Coors and a plastic cup. Thank God for the almighty satellite and for that beautiful man, Scott Hansen. Indentured servitude. Ever wonder how the 49ers were able to stack their team to the point of 4 titles in 1 decade? Sure, having Joe Montana and Bill Walsh helped, but it's undersold how many great players lined up on either side of the ball. Jerry Rice, Roger Craig, Ronnie Lott, Jesse Sapullo, Randy Cross, Dwight Clark, the list goes on and on. That doesn't happen anymore. Players have a contract that lasts anywhere from 3 to 5 years with their first, and after that are in control of their own destiny, which is an oxymoron. They choose where they want to go based on factors like football fit, lifestyle, and most of all, money. There was no real concept of a Super Bowl window in the 80s, largely because free agency didn't yet exist, and there wasn't as much roster turnover as there is today. Player movement has spiced up the offseason, and we're getting more trades and migration than ever, which has only piqued the interest of casual fans. But in the 80s, you could buy a jersey and expect that player to actually be back next year. Corny celebrations. If you've ever seen the Super Bowl Shuffle, you know that no team would ever try that in earnest, lest they be roasted into the earth's crust by fellow players and fans. The 80s included a lot of whack celebrations like Mark Gastineau's roid-induced spasms and the Fun Bunch. Today, dances have evolved for the better. Von Miller's Funky Chicken, John Brown's Flailing Boogie, and even the dreaded Hingle McCringleberry. People were too coked out to dance well in the 80s, but today, Adderall and a little practice works much better. The Browns being good. Believe me, that shit would not fly today. In the 80s, the Browns made the playoffs an astounding 7 times, including 3 times when they were on the verge of reaching the Super Bowl, only to be outdone by John Elway. We're so used to the Browns furiously browning themselves out of contention that the 80s feel like the Paleolithic era.
Who do we got?
But they were good. Bernie Kosar slaying that rock, Ernest Biner was running dudes over, and Ozzie Newsome was owning the middle of the field. But the heartbreak of them moving to Baltimore has given way to general incompetence, and after a short hiatus in the 90s, we no longer can fathom a time when the Browns were a force to be reckoned with. It's like literally too complicated to figure out. Lackluster Super Bowl halftime shows. Before Janet Jackson's right boob, Katy Perry's left shark, and Shakira's tongue inciting a Karen riot on Twitter, the intermission for the biggest game on earth was pretty lackluster. Super Bowl halftime shows in the 80s included Up With People, the Southern University Marching Band, and the Los Angeles Super Drill Team. Eventually, Fox started competing with the NFL, and by the 90s, they would air their 30-minute sketch comedy show in living color during halftime.
And welcome to Men on Football,
taking viewers from whichever network was broadcasting the game. Finally, the NFL and NBC got the picture and hosted the first modern halftime show in 1993, a performance by Michael Jackson to break up the Dallas slaughter of the Bills. That meant people uninterested in the outcome of the game would tune in, and along with the slew of new commercials, the Super Bowl became more than just football. You can argue the old way was better, but do you really want Super Bowl parties to become sausage fests? Didn't think so. Howard Cosell. Howard Cosell was the voice of the NFL in the 70s and 80s, but in 2020, he would get canceled quicker than a Friends spinoff.
According to the reporters, they were told that I called Alvin Garrett a little monkey.
Cosell didn't like to mince words.
My colleagues are not as suitably garbed as I am.
Would frequently have a few drinks while calling a game and even coined the phrase, "He could go all the way." But despite his support of black athletes like Muhammad Ali, Cosell's reference to faster, more elusive players as small primates would not go over well in today's climate. It barely went over in that climate. Today, our favorite personalities are a little safer in their choice of words. It is fun to think about Skip Bayless getting raked over the proverbial coals for a slip of the tongue, or maybe it was better back then when what you meant was more important than what you said. You also didn't get $17 million to broadcast. Slow, methodical offenses. Watching football in the 80s was sometimes akin to watching paint dry. Sure, we had a pass-happy oasis when Dan Marino broke onto the scene with his 48-touchdown extravaganza in 1984, but most of the decade was dominated by split-back sets, sweeps, traps, and fullback dives. Also known as 3 yards and a cloud of dust. There were gunslingers aplenty like Ken O'Brien, Marino, Boomer Esiason, and John Elway, but coaches were still set in their ways, like Elway's head coach Dan Reeves, who only let his rocket arm quarterback throw the ball when they were down in the fourth quarter. The contemporary audience wants speed, shots down the field, and trick plays. That didn't really become the norm until the 90s. Only then were quarterbacks regularly lining up in the shotgun formation, improving their footwork and timing, and pushing the ball down the field with success. But in the 80s, even though speed was a drug of choice, football was a lot slower. The absolute brutality of football. Football is a man's game. It still is, but even more so back in the 80s when the refs let those flags stay in their pockets and safeties were more like enforcers in hockey. If you're wondering why the game went a little slower and teams were a little more reluctant to toss the ball all over the yard back then, it's because receivers could get demolished in the field and quarterbacks could get buried in the backfield, all legally and literally. Shoulder pads were large enough to break down doors like a battering ram, and concussions could be cured by rubbing a little dirt in it. Hell, Ronnie Lott cut off one of his own digits to get back into a game. Between the evolution of the athletes playing the game and the lack of research into safety, the sport's nature may have peaked in the 80s. And as fun as it was to see someone get lit up over the middle and not have to wait for the inevitable flag, it's probably better the way it is now. Not to make you feel old, but the 80s were technically 40 years ago, and a lot has changed in the world and the NFL. There's plenty to feel nostalgic about from the decade of excess and in excess, but it's almost two different games, for better or for worse. The NFL won't get any more dangerous, we think. The shoulder pads won't get bigger, and Howard Cosell shall remain in the ground. That said, could we maybe get that Vortex football commercial back?
The new farthest flying Vortex Mega Flight.
I'm John Elway. I set a world record by throwing the Vortex football over 90 yards.
I'm not John Elway.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to check out our sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends, and use the link below to download the game and get 50,000 silver for free. I'm 5 Points Vids, and you made it to my next video.